Joe recently became a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. He has always had a passion for education and the environment. After graduating from the University of Alberta's Faculty of Education, Joe began his career as an environmental teacher in Alberta, British Columbia, and Arizona. Throughout his teaching career, he was committed to incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing and being into his practice, recognizing the importance of honoring and preserving the traditions and knowledge of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. About 30 years ago, he moved to Ontario. He began working for the City of Toronto 23 years ago, always working hard to make a positive impact in his community. As a dedicated public servant, he has always strived to make the city a better place for everyone. Joe recently took on a new role as an Indigenous consultant for the EarlyON sector of Toronto Children's Services. In this position, he uses his extensive knowledge and experience to help shape policies and programs that are more inclusive and respectful of Indigenous people. Please welcome Joe Robb.
Yeah. How many people have experience working with Indigenous communities? Are there any other Indigenous people in the room today? That's okay, that's good. And that's kind of normal when I go out and talk to people. There's usually not a lot of Indigenous people that either want to self-identify or that are in these spaces. So that's one of the things that we'll talk about a bit later, trying to increase the capacity of Indigenous workers or Indigenous people in positions such as yours. So where we are today. What we know is the Indigenous Learning and Child Care Framework sets out a shared vision, principles, and pathway forward for Indigenous early learning and child care, where all Indigenous children have the opportunity to experience high-quality, culturally rooted early learning and child care programming. We also know that the Indigenous ELCC framework sets the stage for Indigenous governance of improved and new systems of ELCC policy, programs, and supports for Indigenous children and families, now and in the future. And through the engagement sessions that were held a number of years ago, unanimous recognition of the importance of ELCC for Indigenous children and families reaffirmed and echoed the findings from the Royal Commission on Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and the need to honor the rights and obligations set out in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Is that new for anybody? Not really. So you've seen that. So, as I said, I'm not an expert here. I'm hoping that I'm going to draw upon your expertise in the room and talk about the impact on Indigenous families in the rollout of CWELCC. So some of the questions I have, or some of the topics that I want to cover in the next little bit, is has CWELCC made a difference for Indigenous families? Are there strategies in progress or under consideration that would enhance experiences for Indigenous families? For example, retaining Indigenous educators, stable enrollment for families who travel off and on reserve, subsidies, etc. What are the positive changes that the program has brought about for Indigenous families? Examples of how program has helped Indigenous families access high-quality daycare and learning services. And finally, what are the impacts of the program on the overall well-being of Indigenous families? The next slide, just to preface it a little bit, we'll talk about challenges. I want to talk more about the positives right now, and some of the things that you might be seeing, or some of the things that you might have heard in the community. Part of those agreements, like the Métis Nation of Ontario has, the Métis Nation of Canada, they have signed on, and the Métis Nation of Ontario. But yeah, I'm hearing the same thing in my community, which is the Métis community, that even the money that's out there at this moment is not enough. And I think that seems to be the common thread that, I know I'm going into challenges a bit, but, the money isn't enough at this point. The good pieces of it, I guess, would be that, we continue to try to move this forward. However it's going to be at this point, we still need to try to move it forward. I think we always it's quite common that we get stuck in thinking about all the things that are wrong about systems, all the things that, the systems don't provide. But at some point, I also believe that we need to move forward on actions, we need to move forward on policies and procedures, and continue to do the work on the ground or in the institutions and municipalities to make these things happen. And without, people in the room, the people, that are working in this area, it's not going to move forward. So, that's one thing I would definitely say is a positive. We have a group of people here today that are committed to this, I believe, I'm guessing, that are committed to this, and we have to think about how we can move this forward.